All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Back by popular demand is our school meeting webinar. We hosted this last year and we had so much great feedback that we thought it was worth doing it again and kicking off the school year on the right foot by providing insights and education around the traditional school meetings. We know that walking into these meetings, one can feel rather anxious, confused, and we want to try to alleviate some of that stress as best we can by heightening your awareness as to what each of these meetings even are, and then talking through what qualifies a learner to be in that the need for the meeting and then the accommodations and such to follow. So we'll give you all the details about these three core types of meetings. But first and foremost, we're going to do some introductions. We're going to talk about the 2022 trends because things have changed quite a bit in the last couple of years. We want to make sure that we're looking at these meetings through those eyes, through that lens. And then we're going to give you an overview to each of the meetings. Again, what constitutes a meeting and what's covered within. Then we're going to give you some tips and tricks as to how to really maximize those meetings. And if we have time for Q&A in the end, we will absolutely host a Q&A session. Feel free to drop your questions in the chat though. Sometimes we run out of time. And so we always circle back to ensure you get the answers that you need and deserve. Let's do it. Okay, I'm Jess Corinne. I'm head of educational services for Learnfully. I started my career as a classroom teacher. I was a K-1 classroom teacher, super excited to dive into the classroom and apply everything that I had learned in college. Quickly, I soon realized that I felt ill-equipped to serve each and every one of the learners in the classroom. I had so many various needs to address that I really wanted to feel more equipped. And so I moved back to the Bay Area and I joined forces with Linda Mood Bell Learning Processes, where I really honed and refined the art of multisensory evidence-based implementation. I was with Linda Mood Bell through different roles for about 12 years. And then I opened a private practice where I also gained training in Orton-Gillingham, Wilson Reading System, social thinking, step up to writing, just so I could truly feel like I was differentiating my services and individualizing my recommendations for each and every school, learner, community member that I served in my practice. And that's what brought me to Learnfully. At Learnfully, I oversee our instructional implementation, our assessment administration, the recommendations, and the quality of implementation overall. And so without further ado, my partner in crime, Dr. Sheila Murphy, is here to support our school meeting efforts.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. I came into education kind of later in life because of my own three kids who were neurodiverse learners, and knew that there needed to be a system set up for them to ensure their success, but it wasn't happening in the school system. So that was incumbent upon me to do my research to support them. So I actually went back to school, got my teaching credential, went back, got my master's, and was always with a focus on neurodiverse learners. Ended up getting my doctorate degree because I truly believed that going into education was my calling, but to make a grander difference. And so I have always wanted to ensure advocacy for neurodiverse learners and do that in the biggest scope possible. Mm-hmm. So I'm very excited to be here today because I have been in the role of parent in all three of these types of meetings. I've been in the role as a classroom teacher, as a school administrator, and as a district employee. And so I feel like I've seen these meetings from so many multiple different angles that it gives me kind of a richer way of looking at them and speaking to them from different perspectives. And I'm really excited to be here with you today.
I wholeheartedly agree. You are the expert, and I look forward to hearing from you. So first and foremost, we always start with our why, and our why is our mission and our values. So through growth, possibilities, community, partnership, and connections, we strive to ensure that all learners have the access to learn to their fullest potential. We acknowledge that they all learn differently, but we believe that learners deserve to learn fully. Learnfully is a personalized platform. So we are a highly curated network of educational specialists So we have educational therapists and executive functioning coaches. We have school consultants, life coaches such as Sheila, who really guide our community members through the learning process, the trajectory. And so typically what we do is we start with an assessment. We have a Spark learning assessment that allows us to pinpoint where the breakdown is happening in those language processing skills, in executive functioning, in math literacy, conceptual abilities, and beyond. And then we make recommendations based on their interests, their strengths, and their areas of opportunity to an educational specialist who can engage them through those interests, really bolster those strengths, and make sure that they're expediting progress all along the way. We believe wholeheartedly in proactive communication and ensuring that not only our caregivers, but our ecosystem of support have all that they need to serve the learner in a consistent and repetitive way. And so we're constantly updating our parents and that ecosystem of support to ensure that our learners have consistency of implementation and are able to really make progress even in between those sessions through our content library and our progress updates and so forth. So it's a whole team effort with the learner at the center of our model. Okay, so I surveyed quite a few educators to find out what's different this year, because I know we've all heard it, the pandemic is quote unquote over, but it leaves lasting impact, right? And we know that. We have recognized and shown research through our own neurodiversity report and other surveys that really there's been a huge uptick in anxiety, depression, stress, which of course impacts their ability to access information in the classroom. So the reason for referrals for these three types of meetings has actually skyrocketed towards social emotional well-being and health. So it's really the cause for the meeting, as like it's springboarded from their lack of social emotional learning capabilities, executive functioning wise, and that heightened awareness of how the impact of anxiety and depression and stress can have on their ability to even be present in the classroom is creating, justifiably so, concern, and is then kind of igniting the reason for referral into these meetings. So quite a few learners we're now meeting about learners' needs in SEL, social emotional learning, executive functioning, and then of course the application into aptitude areas such as literacy and math. Back in the day, traditionally, a learner would be flagged because of those aptitudes first and foremost. And now what we're seeing is a shift towards one who may not be as inept socially, emotionally, and not able to function executively. And that those inabilities are fogging their brain's capacity to then maximize their learning and really even be engaged in the learning process as a whole. So they're losing opportunities along the way to reach their potential in those aptitude areas. So it really then yields the need for both caregivers and educators to receive more training and development in these areas to ensure that they're truly individualizing their implementation in and out of the classroom and are really gearing those strategies towards SEL and EF first, because those are the precursors to all of these other areas of learning, such as reading, spelling, writing, math, and beyond. So those are the major trends that we're noticing. Now we're going to do is kind of break this further down and give you some information about what are these meetings, what do they even cover, right? What are they? What do they stand for? What happens in these meetings? It's no secret. We want to make sure you have all the information you need to really lean into the conversation if you ever are asked to be a participant. Okay, let's do it, Sheila. So first and foremost, we have been told that other meeting, like there's another acronym for this meeting, an MST, SST, essentially it's a specific student study team meeting, right? So let's dive into what really happens in this meeting, Sheila.
Yeah, so sometimes it's student success team, student study team. Like we said, there's many different names this meeting could be called. So in your state, it could be something else. But typically, this is the first time that you're discussing formally some concerns around your student. Now, this is different than a conference. You have conferences that are set up typically in the fall, maybe November, and then again in the spring. This would be outside of that time, and it's because there's something specific you may have a concern about with your student. This could be, again, a social emotional learning, executive functioning, or it could be academic concerns that you have or that that the teacher, your student's teacher may be coming at you with. And so they want to sit down and have this type of meeting because they have concerns that it's a good idea to document. Whereas what makes it different than just a regular meeting with a teacher, typically those aren't documented. They aren't taking notes. They aren't submitting those notes back to you. And there isn't maybe some trackable data that they're going to be looking for. So they typically, they typically last 30 to 45 minutes. There'll be your teacher in there. There'll be a representative from the school. And then sometimes an administrator will come in. They will also discuss some of hopefully the strengths of your student, any relevant information that you may have. There may be things like history of ADD, ADHD, dyslexia, those kinds of things that are in your family that you could have conversations about. They'll also talk about what are some opportunities for accommodations that might support success for your student. So these accommodations could range from something like more time on an assessment, or half of the math problems in the class, in the homework, a fidget spinner, something that helps with ADD, ADHD. It could be support with organization. So that could be an executive functioning skills and strategies added to your student. So there are many different things that can come up in this meeting, and especially if it's the first one, but it's really helpful to go in with as much information as you can, and creating a plan of action that you will follow up on in a predetermined date, so that you can see if these accommodations have supported success for your student. The notes in this meeting, there are always notes taken. You should always be provided with the notes, not necessarily immediately after the meeting, but within a couple of days, because sometimes they just need to be cleaned up. And then you will read through the notes. If there are other teachers or a tutor or somebody else that you may want to show the notes to and have conversation with, definitely can do that. But these, just so you know, these notes that are signed, and then all the teachers that your student may have will get these same notes with the accommodation list. SSTs are not legally binding. They are just expectations, accommodations, and a documented kind of paper trail, for lack of a better word, to say, these are the things we've tried over time, and these are the things that have worked really well. And maybe there are things that haven't worked, but you can look back and see, oh, we did try that a couple of years ago. They didn't make a change. So let's try this other strategy.
Thanks for that, Sheila. And I have been a parent in this seat. I have sat in SST meetings. I've also facilitated SST meetings, and I've always seen them like an extended parent-teacher conference.
Yeah.
It's not true for every single meeting, but at least in my perspective as a parent sitting in that chair, it gave us more time to dig deeper and discuss where they, of course, find challenges and need to seek solutions and support. So that kind of leads you to the next meeting. So if an SST is not legally binding, but it's very important that you meet as a team and get those notes in place and so forth, then how does that differ from a 504 plan? Because they sound very similar. So I can see how parents would be confused by that.
Absolutely. So the first thing is that a 504 plan is legally binding. So these are tied to typically some kind of medical diagnoses, for example, ADD, ADHD. And so then again, you're looking at what accommodations are needed. These could be for physical accommodations. These could be for learning accommodations. So a 504 meeting might happen if you have a student who is blind or deaf or has ADHD. These are the type, this is what may come into play, so that the schools are legally bound to the things that your student needs, because it is fallen under the Rehabilitation Act, and it's federal. So this is federal. And also when we get into the IEPs, those are federally overseen. So again, they're very similar in that you will talk about strengths, area of needs, accommodations, modifications. You will, in the case of, for example, ADHD, typically they'll ask you to provide a doctor's recommendation note with a diagnosis, and then the, if there are recommendations that you have, that will come into play. So it is a really similar format. It's documented, like I said, just a little bit differently because this one is a federally overseen program. But the meeting is fairly less formal than an IEP, whereas an SST, they're very much about the dialogue and supports and what supports help to ensure the student has success.
And not to add any kind of stress to the equation, but it is like an escalation, if you will. Like you start with an SST, and some schools, mostly independent schools, have SSTs versus the 504 IEPs, but they usually don't follow the IEPs, but because they aren't federally aligned. But the 504 is like the next step to an SST if you're in a public school. And my question for you, Sheila, and forgive me for not knowing this, how long does it follow the learner, or do they need to redo it every few years, like in an IEP?
Excellent question. A 504, because it is typically goes along with a medical diagnosis, a 504 is reviewed annually. Yeah. So
I knew it. Okay.
Yeah. You don't have the same testing like an IEP,
yeah.
we'll get into later. Actually, to get technical, you could have a temporary 504. So let's say there's a temporary medical condition a student has, and they don't need the 504 for the rest of their lives, but they need these accommodations for this certain amount of time. So that's kind of just a fun fact that you may have.
Yeah, that's a great point.
A student who got a severe concussion or something, and for years it won't really be affecting them, but for the next year or 2 years it may. And so these are the accommodations that the doctor is asking for this amount of time, and then you would have that meeting. But that doesn't necessarily mean next year it keeps going on.
The beauty of the 504, I believe strongly that it gives us opportunity, and all of these do, but 504 in particular in my life has given me opportunity to really instill advocacy in my learners and my children, because you technically don't have to. It's really up to the learner to advocate for what accommodations they need within the plan. This is all delineated in a plan. It's all signed off. It's all federally regulated. But at the same time, like some of the accommodations aren't fitting for every class, or they aren't needed all year. They're only needed for finals or what have you. So it's really, really critical that the learner understands the 504 and feels supported, empowered to advocate for which accommodations they want to activate at which point. They might be brought into the conversation. It depends on the age.
Yeah.
But as an ed specialist, as a parent, I would walk line by line and say, okay, let's talk about this. What does this mean for you? It's also a great opportunity to teach them metacognitive strategies of reflecting on how they learn best. So
absolutely. And you really can have pretty young kiddos give input. You may not have them sit through the whole meeting, but you could have, kind of a pre-worksheet to say, what did you notice when you're taking spelling tests, or how do you feel about, or, and having kind of those questions to ask, so that when you go in there, how they feel, and you're not advocating for things either that they don't need, or that maybe more than what they need. Then you're just kind of sending the message that you don't know what you need, or something like that. So it is very important to have those conversations. Kids pretty young can tell you. I remember going into my son's IEP in first grade and him telling me before I got there, now you make sure my teacher knows. Yeah.
Good job, Mama. Yeah. That's really great.
That's 6, right? So
yeah, that's amazing. Okay, so now kind of the finale of the trajectory, if you will. So IEPs, and again, our intention, our purpose, our goal is to shed some of the stress that goes into the not knowing, right? The unknown. So we're going to talk through just the big picture. What is an IEP? And then after we talk about the IEP, we're going to teach you how to prepare and how to follow up to these meetings. So it's coming. Don't worry. Let's start with what is it?
Yeah. So these are most definitely regulated by federal government. An IEP is when your student has gone through multiple tiers of support, and none of these tiers have helped. So they've had maybe pull-out reading, they've had tutors, they've had accommodations, they've had all kinds of things over, typically over a certain amount of time, and none of those things have ensured success in learning. So then a battery of assessments are typically done, and they are compared to a norm. And once those are compared, a decision is made by an IEP team that a student has either does or does not have an IEP put in their file. So an individual education plan, if your student qualifies for one, you will have an initial meeting, which is typically quite long, and they'll go over all of the assessments that they've done with your student and all of the psychological, there'll be academics, they compare these things and they decide, yes, your student qualifies for some sort of maybe specific learning disorder, could be any number of learning disorders, and you'll walk through all of the testing that's done, and then at the very end some recommendations will be made. If you're going into then after the IEP happens, you'll have an annual meeting, and every month, I mean once every year, once a month, every year you will have a meeting to assess how your student is doing. And then every 3 years, the assessments will happen again. So that's called a triannual. The great thing about having an IEP is there are goals that are set for your students. And this is probably one of the most important things to know as a parent, that these goals will be time bound. When you look at how the time bound of these goals, so sometimes they're 3 months, sometimes they're 1 year, you should be getting every 3 to 4 months, you should be getting progress on goals. So you should be getting a paper that comes home that says your student is working towards meeting this goal, or your student is not meeting the assessments working towards this goal. And it's really important because you don't want to go into your IEP meeting 1 year, full year has gone by, and you realize that your student has not met any of their goals, because that means something's not happening. The accommodations aren't working. The goal was too ambitious. There was a disconnect somewhere. And so it's really important to follow up in between. So
100% agree.
Yeah. The really important thing about going into an IEP meeting is that you can be in the driver's seat. They can be really intimidating. It's a whole team of educators. These assessments have acronyms. They're going left and right about numbers and percentiles, and it can be very overwhelming and very stressful. So it's really good to do as much homework ahead of time as you can to really understand what is an IEP going to look like, what is the flow of it going to look like, preparing questions, understanding just what does the testing mean. You don't have to get down in the weeds about it, but have a high level understanding so that when you go in, you're kind of able to follow. I remember my first IEP meeting, I was like, I have no idea what's going on here.
Yeah, I mean, walking in and already feeling concerned about your child, clearly, right? It's like walking into a doctor's office, not knowing what you're going to hear. Once you hear something, you start closing off that information. So research would say the more you prepare, and we're going to give you some tips in a moment, but the more you prepare, the better off you will be in the meeting. And again, as the caregiver in the room, I think we're going to get to this in the next one, but as a caregiver in the room, you have the right to ask questions, to pause the meeting, to take a break, to seek solutions and support by asking people like us, how to guide you through that meeting or to kind of strategize beforehand. So there's a lot of support solutions out there that kind of alleviate a little bit of that stress walking in.
Yeah. And you can bring an educational consultant with you.
Mm-hmm.
They can't tell you you can't. So you can bring people with you if you feel lost, for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So you want to understand, not only what are some of the accommodations or recommendations that are going to happen, but how are they going to achieve the goals that they're setting. So you don't want the goals just to, they'll be reading and answering comprehension questions at an 80% accuracy rate in 3 out of 4 tries. What does that even mean, right? And so first of all, just decoding that, but then what is the action plan for that to even happen? And that's really important. Those are some important questions that you can ask, because if they don't have a plan, you'll want to be part of that conversation as well.
I love that. Thank you. So if you were to look at, the 504 and IEP comparison, right? If you were to visualize a Venn diagram, how do they compare? How are they different? Just the nitty gritty would be plenty.
Yeah. So 504s typically are working more towards what are some accommodations that a student might need. May or may not have goals attached to them. IEPs are very specific with their goals. It's a document where a whole battery of assessments have been done for an IEP, not necessarily a 504. They are both, if we're looking at a Venn diagram, they are both federally covered. And so you do have protections to ensure that the things are happening. And so you do have that backing you. There are annual meetings for both. However, you will get updates from the IEP throughout the year, not for a 504. You'll also have every 3 years to be retested for an IEP.
That was one of our questions, is the same information discussed in an annual and a triannual? And I think, can we just answer that? I think you just answered it, but can we be clear?
Yeah, that's a great question.
It is.
Wow. Okay. So a triannual is more like the initial. So the initial is a whole battery of assessments that you will not have in your annual meetings. So year 1 is your initial. It'll be a very long battery of assessments done. You'll meet and you'll say this student does or does not qualify for an IEP. And then if they qualify, what are the goals? Then the next year, it's more about, do we change the goals? Are the goals still appropriate? Whatever it might be. The next year again, meet again, go over the same goals. Then the next year, so we're in year 3, all the battery of tests happen again. And then it's a discussion of, is the student still qualified for an IEP? Because sometimes they don't need one anymore. And then it starts the cycle all over again. So an initial and a triannual are more alike than the annual IEPs.
Well stated. Yeah. And most likely have to account for more time in that meeting. They're going to be lengthier.
Absolutely.
Way more information to review. So don't feel pressured in the moment to review it on the spot. Take your time to go home and review the information, because it does involve more test scores that you may as a parent not be as familiar with.
Absolutely.
I think it's important no matter what meeting you're in, but to ensure that you agree with everything that was set forth in terms of goals and the plan.
Absolutely.
So that kind of segues, how do we maximize these meetings, right? Like, ensuring that we prepare is one thing, but I think we should give some tools in terms of how do you really prepare? What does it come down to, right? When it comes to preparing for the meeting and making sure it's all personal, this journey, but how you feel rearing to go and you feel confident walking in the door.
So one thing that just literally popped in my head when you were on the other slide One thing that I think helped me, and I never was given this benefit, was ask for the IEP before your meeting. Oddly enough, many schools will not provide it with you, but they have to if you ask for it. So ask for it ahead of time. Then you have time to compose a list of questions. Not only that, but if there's so many acronyms to look up, you can kind of create a cheat sheet, or you can ask, if you have a tutor or educational consultant that you work with, and really hone in and understand what it means. You can also create questions. If you're not going to bring your kiddo in there with you, you can actually create the list of questions that they might have, or say, how do you feel about this? Or what do you think could help you in this area? So they'll give you kind of areas of strength, areas of weaknesses. So you can talk to your student about all of those things ahead of time. So that would really maximize the meeting once you're there in person. Yeah, the reflect on observations I love, because kids can sometimes behave differently, not sometimes, many times behave differently at home and at school. And so I remember thinking, my goodness, my son knows how to do this. Why does he get to school and he can't do it? But then you realize there's so many distractions, there's so much noise, there's the angst of, I don't know the answer. And so when he's at home, it was relaxed. And then when he got to school, he couldn't do it. So all of those things are very helpful information to give to the meeting when you're there. The questions and concerns, you definitely want to show up with those. Always having previous year information, so helpful. And one, be willing to listen, because again, when I go back to your child behaves differently at school and at home, sometimes you need to listen to what they are doing at school. It gives so much insight, especially right now where social emotional learning, executive functioning skills are at a high time struggle rate. There may be behaviors that are happening that you have never seen exhibited, but they're maybe only happening at school. Little tummy aches here and there, lashing out, disorganization. There's so many things that at home you may not see, but by listening and kind of sitting back, please, it's so hard, I know, not to be defensive because they're your kiddos, but just listening with an open heart and an open mind and asking questions like, tell me more about that. Because sometimes the tell me more about that can reveal some behaviors that are happening in the classroom, either by other students or teacher, that may bring some things to light also. So it's so important to listen.
Yeah,
listen.
Absolutely. As I actively listen and talk over you. I apologize, but I was so excited about it.
It's so fun.
It's true. And it's also that, it's the whole doctor example. We're stressed, so sometimes we aren't even fully present because the anxiety has kind of taken over our ability to focus. And so I think actively listening, taking notes, bringing in a binder of the classwork, or I have like an accordion plastic folder I keep, whatever you find joy in organizing your students' records, just so that you feel like you have something else to help you refocus, just for your own sake of redirecting and being present and being able to take it all in listening wise, and kind of give yourself a goal of asking questions, because sometimes that allows us to fully interact and be engaged in the conversation.
Yeah. And I would always start with, I know we're all here because we have the best interest of, my son or my child at heart. So let's make sure that we, in my head also of like, okay, this has to be teamwork, because you will not have what you need for your child if you don't create a cohesive team. So ensuring that you are walking in as a team member and not an adversary.
That goes to our next slide too. Yeah, it's that idea of assuming the best intentions. I appreciate that you said that, because quite often it's hard. I know it's hard for all of us, because we want to advocate for our child, but sometimes they really truly need and deserve the support. And so listening through their recommendations and and reading your audience and assuming the best intentions are my go-to tips.
Yeah, absolutely. Because oftentimes by the time you've gotten to an IEP, there's a lot of frustration because a long time maybe has gone by with a student that's had academic struggles or social emotional struggles. And so a lot of time maybe it's gone by, and so people are frustrated. The teachers may be frustrated. With my son, they were frustrated because they just couldn't figure out what the best way to teach him was. Because he was dyslexic, dysgraphia, dysgraphia, and auditory processing. So he couldn't learn auditorily, he couldn't write, and he couldn't read. Kind of frustrating for a teacher who's looking for success. So there was a lot of frustration on their part, which came across as, an unwanted behavior to him. So that was tough because he was not a misbehaved child. He was just very quiet and sat in the corner, tried to be ignored. And so it made it hard for them. And that sometimes.
And usually, like you said, usually by the time you get to this stage, and every state's different. So I'm not going to quote a percentile or anything, but usually your child has fallen quite a few grade levels behind.
Absolutely.
So as a caregiver watching that, I'm going to get emotional. It's very, very hard.
Yeah.
So you're going into it with that emotional turmoil too, just like your learner is in the classroom, and the teacher is, you're all feeling it.
Yes.
So I think like clearing the mind before you go in and ensuring that you look at it like an opportunity to change the game for your learner, for your child after they've struggled for so long is an optimistic outlook for sure.
Absolutely. And it's just a necessary and essential. So you got to find a way to do it, because by the time my third son came around, I was like, we're all going to be best friends.
That is the benefit of having your kids all go through the same school. You make friends. That's
2 years
a huge
apart.
part.
Like,
yeah. It's helpful to have friends in the front office that know who's going to be in that meeting in advance too, so that if you have to at least initiate a conversation or introduce yourself to kind of break the ice before you get in the room, that tends to happen and help quite a bit. So let's talk about follow-up, because it's important to prepare, reduce a little bit of anxiety, feeling equipped, feeling confident, that sense of bravado walking in the room, but then you get all this floodgate of information. So what do you do afterwards to really optimize the follow-up efforts?
Yeah. So definitely looking over the notes, thinking about it, asking questions, formulating them, but also getting, if you have somewhere to get outside advice after looking, having the meeting and maybe processing it over and taking your time with it. Email, participants, thanking them. Any questions you might have is great timing to ask the questions before you sign. And then if you're comfortable with everything, then feel free to sign it. If you aren't comfortable and you have more questions, absolutely request and schedule a follow-up meeting. Really important to don't feel pressured that you have to know and feel like you have all the information that you need to ensure this whole follow-up year of success.
Yeah, I think a lot of time parents, I've been in many meetings on the educator side where many parents felt rushed to sign, and you don't have to feel, nobody in the room feels that way. Like they might come off as if they just want to get it done and move on. And if you assume the best intentions, you realize they just want to start working on those goals. They just want to start helping your learner succeed and start to feel success again. And so I think it's really, they really do have the best interest of the child because they want to get started, and they can't get started until you sign. So if you have had a meeting in the past, I think I saw a question in the chat. If you have had a meeting in the past and you didn't sign off on the IEP, then it's not an active IEP, right, Sheila? Like it's not an illegal document.
And they cannot start working on any of the goals without that signed. So they have to revert back to the previous IEP until you've signed. So that is one challenge if you don't sign.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you sign right away and you start to track, because the next slide is all about how you track, right? Start documenting some of those changes that you see, start collecting work samples that come home. But if they don't see the traction or the progress they anticipate based on the benchmarks that they delineate in the IEP that you have signed at this point, then you can call another meeting. So you can have, is an addendum?
Absolutely.
I think it's called, you can have a second, third, fourth, however many meetings you need. It's your right as the parent to request a follow-up meeting to discuss how they're tracking towards those benchmark goals.
Yes,
And you,
absolutely.
yeah, you can also request the documentation so that the team has to substantiate what they're working on. And as teachers, we're data collectors. We have the information, so don't feel nervous, scared about asking for it, because teachers are taking data, and if they're not, they should be, right? So like, for the most part, they have it, they're equipped, they're ready to provide it to you. They're just waiting for you to ask. So don't
Yeah,
feel bad about asking for documentation for
absolutely.
their goals.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think it's really important to ask and to monitor it and not just let it go, because if they aren't, you need to know that too.
Totally. I fully agree. Okay. So what's one final piece, Sheila, that you would give caregivers, if we have educators in the room, one final piece of advice that you want them to walk away understanding?
I would say one thing that we kind of skipped over, but it's okay, is that saving emails. I think one piece of advice that I would give that's really important is that don't assume somebody else is doing all of the tracking from year to year, the documentation, the communication. All of that is kind of incumbent upon the parent to keep moving in the forward direction. If you are really feeling that your student has either a learning disability or social, emotional, academic, executive functioning challenges, what has been tried, what's working, what's not working, keeping that documented is so important. And having the emails, having the any piece of information that you can share with the this current year's either educators or team of educators.
That's a great point.
Yeah, so it's just really important. You are your student's advocate, and so don't assume somebody else is advocating. Make sure that you're advocating, because nobody loves and cares about your child the way you do. That's kind of our job, right? So just ensure that you are keeping those pieces into play, moving forward at all times.
And just to echo that sentiment of, if you place a phone call to request another meeting, or you place any phone call, what I've heard in terms of best practices is just like you said, Sheila, is to follow up with an email. Just make sure that you write it down and that we have a paper trail. If you ever need to pull it out and say, oh, well, I followed up on these dates, you have it all there. It's all in kind. These emails are gentle and ginger. They're positive and productive, but they need to be put in writing and submitted and sent off, so that you have a track record of your advocacy efforts.
Absolutely. Yeah. And communication is key. Communication is always key. Just keeping on
And
top.
they appreciate it too. I know they're really busy, but again, they much rather have a proactive, transparent relationship with you than have any confusion and stress come as a result of that, because that just snowballs later on. So they much rather it be forward thinking and front, you know what I mean, proactive. Yeah, exactly. Take initiative is what I'm saying. Follow through. And also, just one other follow up to that is ensuring that you're helping your learner advocate for themselves as they get older. At a very young age, you can sprinkle in some of the discussion, but especially as they get up elementary and beyond, it's coaching them on how to do your advocacy work live.
Yes, absolutely. Advocating and not the one thing you want to be very mindful of is over accommodating, overdoing things, because you want your learner to be able to advocate for themselves. You want them to be able to push their thinking and push themselves. And so you don't want to have so many accommodations the learner doesn't have to kind of push their thinking at any point. So there's a fine balance, because you want to accommodate for success, but you also don't want to over accommodate so that they learn how to just sit passively and get fed information.
Exactly. Yeah. You want to raise the bar enough where it's this dance we play between challenging and easy, because we do want to ingrain a sense of growth mindset and grit and realizing their potential instead of kind of just skating by. So I totally agree with you, Sheila. Thank you for all of your support and your advice. That was so extremely helpful. If you have any questions about the IEP consulting program that we have at Learnfully, please feel free to reach out. Our typical trajectory is we start with a questionnaire. So if you really just want a consultation about your child's IEP or where they stand and how they should move forward, we would do this questionnaire with you as well to ensure that we're looking at your child, your learner through your lens first. And then if we feel as if we want to do our own Spark assessment, it allows us an opportunity to meet your learner, get to know them, provide you with insight in terms of those areas of opportunity and strengths, and then make a learning plan, really creating and delineating a learning profile that also comes with recommendations to the program, duration, frequency, and so forth. But all in this mix, we can consult all along the way. We join many of team meetings as educational specialists because we believe collaboration is the key to success. So know that no matter where your learner is on this journey at Learnfully, we can consult and collaborate every step of the way. It's really important to note also that if we feel like your learner would benefit from educational therapy and executive functioning coaching, we will be the first to say it. We are very transparent and honest. So if we feel as if, let's say, the learner could be making more expedited progress, now let's be honest, schools don't have the ability to provide intensive instruction, and some learners need intensive instruction to really move the needle and feel successful and confident. We will be the first one to recommend it. You don't have to take us up on it, but at least you know walking into the IEP or following up to the IEP, you can compare the data and take our recommendations and see how we can work together as a team to make sure your learner is on a positive path towards their potential. In those recommendations, we'll also look at things like formatting. We're almost all moms here, moms, dads, caregivers. We know that flexibility is also integral. And so we want to ensure that we have those flexible formats. We have virtual, we have in-person, we have hybrid, we have one-on-one, pairs, small groups, and classes. So really it's what's in your child's best interest. We most likely offer it within the educational therapy and executive functioning realms. I tried to answer your questions live and we've had somebody else helping us. I hope that I was able to do that because I was checking our time, and yes, sure enough, we run out of time. There might be one or two that we haven't answered. Feel free to drop your email in a direct chat to one of us and we can circle back to ensure you get all your questions answered. Again, if you want to reach out, feel free to email us, text us, follow us on socials. We'll send a recording of this webinar along with the checklist resource and a few links to our past blogs about each of these school meetings individually. So you'll have those resources at your fingertips as you launch into a successful school year with your child. Thank you everybody for joining us. We are so grateful and we look forward to seeing you next month. We are hosting weekly webinars for Learning Disability Awareness Month. So check out our events page and we hope that you can join us then. Thanks everybody. Thank you, Sheila.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.